January 25th, 1990, New York. Avianca Flight 052. 158 people. A 22-year-old Boeing 707. 3 holding patterns. 1 hour and 17 minutes of circling. 1 missed approach. 4 engines flamed out one after another in the dark. 73 dead. The pilots never said the one word that could have saved them. They said everything around it. They said, running out of fuel. They said, we need priority. They said, we can only hold 5 more minutes. Air traffic control heard all of it. And none of it triggered the response that the crew needed, because none of it was the word emergency. How does an airplane with more than enough fuel at departure crash 16 miles from the runway with its tanks bone dry? The answer is a story about a system that was overwhelmed, a crew that was passive, and a single word that was never spoken. It is also a story about what happens when everyone assumes someone else understands the situation, and no one stops to confirm. The fuel gauges on Avianca 052 did not drop to 0 because of a mechanical failure. They dropped to 0 because every person involved, the pilots, the controllers, the dispatchers, the flow control specialists, each made decisions that were individually reasonable and collectively fatal. This is the story of the crash that changed aviation communication forever. And it begins on a winter afternoon in Medellín, Colombia, where a crew of 9 was preparing a Boeing 707 for the 4-hour and 40-minute flight to New York. In command was a 51-year-old captain who had been flying for Avianca since 1962. He held type ratings on multiple Boeing aircraft and had accumulated 16,781 hours, including about 1,500 on the 707. His first officer was 28 years old, with 1,837 total hours, just 64 of them on the 707. The seniority gap between them was vast. The captain had joined Avianca 3 months after the first officer was born. The third crew member was a 45-year-old flight engineer, actually the most experienced on the type, with over 3,000 hours on the 707. None of the 3 had any record of training difficulties, but Avianca in 1990 did not train its crews in crew resource management, the discipline designed to ensure that every crew member's knowledge and awareness is used effectively. The captain did not speak enough English to feel comfortable communicating directly with American air traffic controllers. That responsibility fell almost entirely to the first officer. The aircraft was a Boeing 707-321B, registration Hotel Kilo 2016, purchased from Pan Am in 1977. It was 22 years old, with over 61,000 flight hours. The technical log carried several deferred items. Most significantly, the autopilot was placarded inoperative. This meant the captain would have to hand fly the entire route from Medellín to New York, over 4 hours of manual flying that would add substantially to his workload. The flight directors were also reported as unreliable in approach mode, which meant that any instrument approach would have to be flown using raw data, a far more demanding technique, requiring the pilot to interpret crude deviation indicators without the guidance overlay that normally simplified the task. 9 cabin crew oversaw the boarding of 149 passengers. The door closed on 158 souls. Before departure, the crew received their flight plan from an Avianca dispatch contractor in Miami. The plan listed Boston as the alternate airport in case they could not land at JFK. But the weather forecast for Boston showed 3/4 of a mile visibility and rain, with a 500-foot ceiling, well below Avianca's own requirement of 1,000 feet and 10 kilometers. The reason Boston had been selected was that the dispatch contractor's computer system automatically entered Boston as the alternate for every JFK-bound flight, without checking the actual weather. Avianca's dispatchers did not catch it, and the pilots, who should have verified that the alternate met weather requirements as part of their pre-flight duties, did not catch it either. If anyone had looked, they would have changed the alternate to Buffalo or Syracuse, both of which were reporting fine weather, but nobody looked. The weather forecasts the crew received were already 9 to 10 hours out of date. They showed JFK with 1 mile visibility and rain, overcast at 800 feet, and winds gusting to 30 knots. Poor, but above minimums. What the forecast did not show was what was actually developing over the northeastern United States. A massive low-pressure system was generating fog, rain, and high winds across the entire eastern seaboard. Conditions at JFK were deteriorating far faster than predicted, and the Federal Aviation Administration's Central Flow Control Facility in Washington had been struggling with the situation since early morning. Flow Control's job was to match demand to capacity at major airports. When bad weather reduced the number of planes an airport could accept per hour, Flow Control responded by delaying departures so the airspace did not become overloaded. On this day, the TRACON specialists handling the New York area reported that JFK's acceptance rate would likely fall as low as 28 aircraft per hour. But Flow Control set the program at 33 per hour, because accepting only 28 would force 3-hour ground delays on domestic flights, and the political pressure to keep traffic moving was intense. More than 50 international flights, already airborne from Europe, would need to land at JFK that afternoon regardless. Domestic flights would have to absorb the delay. The TRACON specialist protested. Flow Control overruled him. The result was that more aircraft were released toward New York than the airport could handle. The excess would have to hold in the air or divert. At 15:08, Avianca Flight 052 departed Medellín with 82,000 pounds of fuel, well above the minimum required. The crew likely felt comfortable with their fuel load. They had no idea what was waiting for them over New York. For several hours, the flight proceeded north uneventfully. At no point during the cruise did the crew contact Avianca's dispatch center in Miami to request updated weather or traffic information for JFK. Investigators later reviewed every communication along the entire route and found no record of any such request. Avianca dispatchers confirmed that they rarely heard from any Avianca crew at all. The culture did not encourage pilots to be assertive or to seek out information beyond what was given to them at departure. At 19:04, 250 nautical miles south of JFK, the Washington Air Route Traffic Control Center placed Flight 052 into a holding pattern over Norfolk, Virginia. The entire New York airspace was backed up. Not only were the holding points in the New York sector full, but the overflow had spilled south into Washington's sector as well. After 19 minutes over Norfolk, they were cleared to continue to the Bolton intersection near Atlantic City, where they entered a second hold at 19:43. The fuel was burning, the clock was running, and the crew said nothing. After 26 minutes at Atlantic City, the first officer asked Washington for information about delays into Boston. This was the first sign that the crew was becoming concerned. Washington told them Boston was open and that they should expect an additional 30 minutes of holding in New York airspace for JFK. 30 more minutes on top of the 45 they had already held. This should have triggered urgent fuel calculations and a serious discussion about diversion. But there is no evidence that the flight engineer performed any diversion fuel calculations at any point during the flight. To understand why this mattered, you need to know how fuel planning works. Before departure, a crew establishes a minimum diversion fuel level, the amount needed to safely fly from the destination to the alternate airport, plus reserves. If the remaining fuel is predicted to approach that level before the crew begins their approach, the correct decision is to divert immediately. The calculation is simple. The discipline is what matters. And on Flight 052, neither the calculation nor the discipline was present. At 20:12, Flight 052 was cleared into the New York sector and directed to the Cameron intersection, 39 miles south of JFK. Cameron was the handoff point between the ARTCC and the TRACON, but on this day, aircraft were stacked in holding patterns over Cameron at multiple flight levels, waiting for space in the approach queue. Flight 052 was last in line. If you subscribe to this channel, you already know what happens when a crew lets themselves drift into a fuel emergency without a plan. But what makes this case different is what happened next, because the crew did try to communicate urgency. They just used the wrong word. At 2018, the controller gave them an expect further clearance time of 2030. The crew likely interpreted this as the time they would be cleared for approach. It was not. It was simply the time the controller expected to clear them to descend further. The distinction was critical, but never explained. At 2030, a new clearance time of 2039 was issued, with a descent to 11,000 feet. The crew accepted without protest. 2039 came and went. No clearance. By this point, Flight 052 had been holding for over an hour at 3 different locations. They had consumed all their en route fuel, most of their contingency fuel, and most of their diversion fuel. Landing at JFK would now require dipping into their final reserve, fuel that is never supposed to be used except in a genuine emergency. At 2044, the controller issued a new expect further clearance time of 21:05, 20 more minutes. The first officer keyed the microphone and said the words that would define this accident. We need priority. Priority. Not emergency, not mayday, not pan-pan. The word priority conveyed urgency, but not emergency. To the controller, it meant favorable treatment, not that other aircraft needed to be moved out of the way immediately. But to the first officer, trained by Boeing instructors who had told him that requesting priority in a low-fuel situation would produce the same ATC response as declaring an emergency, it meant exactly that. The controller asked how long they could hold. The first officer replied that they could hold about 5 more minutes. That was all they could do. He meant that in 5 minutes, they might not have enough fuel to reach the runway. The controller heard that in 5 minutes they would have to divert to their alternate. Meanwhile, a handoff controller called the TRACON to ask if they could accept Flight 052. He relayed that the flight could only do 5 more minutes in the hold. But he did not mention that the crew had said they could no longer reach their alternate. That information, the most critical piece of the puzzle, was lost in the handoff. The TRACON accepted the flight. The crew believed they were receiving emergency priority. The TRACON believed they were handling a routine, low-fuel situation with an available alternate. Less than a minute later, Flight 052 was cleared out of holding and toward JFK. But because they had been released early, they lacked proper separation from the aircraft ahead. The TRACON controller instructed them to turn right for spacing, effectively putting them in another hold. If the crew had declared an emergency, other aircraft would have been moved out of the way instead. But they accepted the instruction without protest. 6 more minutes burned. 6 minutes they had said they did not have. The crew was now committed. Their fuel was below emergency minimums. The weather at JFK showed an indefinite ceiling at 200 feet, a quarter-mile visibility, drizzle, fog, and winds from the southwest at 17 knots. 20% of flights attempting the approach to runway 22 left were going around due to low visibility. This was not the time to commit to this airport, but the crew had no alternate. They had no fuel. They had no choice. At 21:11, the TRACON cleared Flight 052 for the ILS approach to runway 22 left. In the cabin, 149 passengers had now been airborne for over 6 hours. Many had been asleep. Others stared out into the blackness, watching rain streak horizontally across the windows. The flight attendants had made no announcements about the fuel situation. The cockpit had not briefed them. Nobody in the back of the aircraft knew that the fuel gauges were approaching zero, or that the crew had already told air traffic control they were running out. Up front, the captain faced the hardest approach of his career. Hand flying, with no autopilot. No functioning flight directors in approach mode. Only the raw data deviation indicators, a pair of crude needles showing how far left or right, how far above or below the correct path the aircraft was. Flying raw data ILS in good weather with a rested crew is challenging. Flying it at night, in rain and fog, with a 60-knot headwind, severe wind shear reported on final, critically low fuel, and the accumulated stress of 6 hours of hand flying and over an hour of holding was something else entirely. The captain struggled. He chased the glide slope, overcorrecting above and then back below repeatedly. The first officer called out deviations. Slightly below glide slope, the captain pitched up. Above glide slope, he pitched down. Each correction arrived too late and too large. The first officer warned again. Below glide slope, the captain snapped at him. "Tell me things louder, because I am not hearing it." It was the voice of a man at the edge of his capacity. At 200 feet above a residential neighborhood, 1.5 miles from the runway, the wind shear struck. The headwind that had been holding the aircraft back dropped by 30 to 40 knots in a matter of seconds. The airspeed bled off. The aircraft sank. The ground proximity warning system erupted. Sink rate, sink rate. It sounded 13 separate times as the aircraft descended toward the rooftops below. The crew strained to see the runway through the rain-streaked windshield. The visibility was a quarter mile. The ceiling was 200 feet. The captain called out across the cockpit, "The runway, where is it?" The first officer replied, "I do not see it. I do not see it." They were below 200 feet, below the decision altitude, in the clouds, with no visual reference. The captain could have continued the descent, gambling that the runway lights would appear in the next few seconds. Some pilots in his position might have, but if the runway did not appear, they would fly into the ground a mile and a half short. The captain made the only responsible decision available to him. "Give me gear up. Go around." The flight engineer immediately warned him, "Be smooth with the nose. Do not pitch up sharply." With the fuel tanks nearly empty, an abrupt attitude change could cause the fuel to slosh away from the pump inlets. If the pumps uncovered, the engines would flame out. So the captain had to climb gently, carefully, nursing the last drops of fuel, while the ground proximity warning continued to blare beneath them. The first officer transmitted the missed approach to Kennedy Tower. Executing a missed approach. Avianca 052 Heavy. The tower responded with a heading and a climb to 2,000 feet. In the cockpit, the captain started to say, "We do not have fuel." But the first officer simply read back the clearance and did not challenge it. The captain insisted, "Tell them we are in an emergency." The first officer keyed the microphone. "We are running out of fuel." Still, not the word emergency. Still not Mayday. Still not Pan. The tower handed them off to the TRACON for resequencing. The TRACON controller proposed a routing 15 miles northeast before turning them back for the approach. 15 miles. The flight engineer commented that the controller sounded angry. The first officer replied quietly, "I guess so. Thank you very much." They flew the heading, 15 miles away from the airport they desperately needed. And then, for 2 full minutes, there was silence in the cockpit. No coordination, no planning, no protests, just the sound of the engines and the wind. The captain finally broke the silence. "Take it easy." It was the quiet of men who had stopped fighting. At 21:32, with the fuel gauges reading near zero, Flight 052 began its base turn to intercept the localizer for a second approach. They were 15 miles from the airport. For a moment, the sequence felt almost normal. The aircraft turned. The localizer signal appeared. The first officer began setting up the instruments. Seconds later, the fuel tanks ran dry. Engine 4 flamed out first. The flight engineer called it. Then Engine 3. The power instruments unwound. The familiar hum of the turbines, the sound that had accompanied them for over 6 hours, began to die. Engine 2 went next, then Engine 1. The generators dropped offline. The cockpit displays went dark. The lights in the cabin went out. The cockpit voice recorder captured one last exchange. The first officer setting up the approach frequency, and then silence. The recording stopped as the final generator lost power. In the sudden quiet, the only sounds were the wind outside and the creak of the airframe. A 200-ton Boeing 707 was now a glider, descending through the clouds over the north shore of Long Island, in rain and darkness with no engines, no electrical power, no instruments, and 158 people on board. The pilots could see nothing. They could control the aircraft only through the mechanical cable connections to the flight surfaces that still functioned without hydraulic boost. The captain had no way to know how far they were from the ground, no way to know what was below them. He asked the first officer to show him the runway. They were still 15 miles away. At 21:34, Avianca Flight 052 struck a wooded hillside in the village of Cove Neck on Long Island's north shore. The aircraft clipped trees, snagged power lines, and slammed nose first into the steep slope at an angle of 24 degrees. The fuselage shattered into 3 sections. The cockpit and forward cabin separated from the main body and were hurled over the crest of the hill, crashing through the backyard deck of a private home and coming to rest 90 feet from the rest of the wreckage. The center fuselage stopped on the upward slope, tilted at nearly 45 degrees, its torn end facing south. The tail section skidded across a residential road. Because there was no fuel left in the tanks, there was no fire. That single fact saved dozens of lives. But the impact forces were devastating. The 9G-rated seats buckled, tore from their floor tracks, and broke apart. Passengers were thrown forward into the seat frames ahead of them, or ejected from the fuselage entirely. All 3 pilots were killed. 5 of the 6 cabin crew were killed. 65 passengers died. 85 survived, but all except 2 infants suffered serious injuries: broken legs, shattered hips, fractured spines, crushed ribs, head trauma. Many required months or years of recovery. Emergency crews arrived to find wreckage scattered across the hillside in the rain. A paramedic who lived half a mile away was first on the scene. Residents of Cove Neck, a quiet, wealthy village of wooded estates, came outside to find pieces of an airliner in their gardens. At Kennedy Airport, families who had come to meet Flight 052 waited at the gate for an arrival that would never come. The NTSB investigation found that the probable cause was the crew's failure to manage their fuel and their failure to communicate a fuel emergency to air traffic control before fuel exhaustion occurred. Contributing factors included the crew's failure to request updated weather and traffic information en route, the FAA's inadequate traffic flow management that allowed more aircraft into the New York area than JFK could handle, and the difficulty of the manual raw data approach in severe weather and wind shear that prevented the crew from landing on their first attempt. 2 NTSB members filed dissenting opinions. One argued that the report did not adequately address the failures of air traffic control or the FAA's role in overloading the airspace. The other argued that standardized emergency terminology already existed, and the problem was simply that the pilots failed to use it. Both dissents pointed to a truth that the main report tried to balance. There was enough blame to go around. But the deeper lesson was about language. The first officer said priority. He meant emergency. The controller heard something less. The handoff controller relayed the urgency without the critical detail that the alternate was unreachable. The TRACON received a flight that it believed had options. The flight had none. Every person in the chain acted on what they understood. And what they understood was wrong, because the words were wrong. Avianca 052 did not have CRM training. The captain could not communicate directly with American controllers in English. The first officer, trained by Boeing, genuinely believed that priority would produce the same response as emergency. The flight engineer performed no diversion fuel calculations during the entire flight. The dispatchers used a computer that automatically selected Boston as the alternate, without checking the weather. The pilots never requested updated weather or traffic information after departure. Nobody along the way stopped to ask the one question that could have broken the chain. Do you need to declare an emergency? In the years that followed, the crash of Avianca 052 reshaped aviation communication worldwide. The International Civil Aviation Organization established the first unified global standards for English language proficiency, ensuring that pilots from every country could communicate unambiguously in the language of aviation. The FAA implemented new rules, requiring controllers to ask directly about fuel status when they suspected a problem. The terminology itself was formalized. The word priority lost its ambiguous power. What remained were 2 clear, universally understood declarations. Mayday for immediate life-threatening emergencies. Pan for urgent situations requiring priority. No room for interpretation, no room for assumption, no room for the gap that killed 73 people over Long Island. The FAA also reformed its traffic flow management procedures to prevent the deliberate overloading of airspace that had contributed to the crisis. Seat strength standards were upgraded from 9 Gs to 16 Gs after investigators found that the seats on Flight 052 had buckled and torn free from the floor, turning survivable impacts into fatal ones for dozens of passengers. On January 25, 1990, a Boeing 707 departed Medellín with more than enough fuel to reach New York. It held for an hour and 17 minutes over 3 different points. It flew a missed approach in wind shear and fog. It was vectored 15 miles away from the airport it desperately needed to reach. And then its engines went silent, one by one, over a quiet village on Long Island. The first officer had told controllers they were running out of fuel. He had said they needed priority. He had said they could only hold 5 more minutes. He said everything except the one word that would have cleared every other aircraft out of their path and put them on the runway in minutes. He never said emergency, and 73 people paid for that silence. If this story is hard to hear, consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next. We tell these stories because the lessons inside them are still saving lives today. Every time a pilot keys the microphone and says "Mayday fuel," the crew of Avianca 052 is the reason why. In our next video, we will look at a flight where the crew did say the word. They declared the emergency. They got the priority. And it still was not enough. Because the problem was not in the air, it was on the ground.